He lost his arm and leg, but not his hope. Every day he came with his daughter to a small cafe where the owner looked at him differently than everyone else. She saw not his disabilities, but a father who was ready to do anything for his child. But one day he decided to hug her and confess what he had been hiding for too long. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The alarm clock rang earlier than the sun, a dull buzzing that cut through the silence of the small house. He reached over instinctively, forgetting for a fleeting second that the hand he once used for everything was no longer there. The prosthetic arm responded with a faint whir, the mechanical fingers pressing the button with a stiffness that still felt foreign. He sat up, letting the quiet of the morning settle around him. The walls were thin, and from down the hall came the faint sound of his daughter's breathing, steady and peaceful. For a moment, he just listened to it, reminding himself that she was the reason he got up every day, the reason he forced his body into motions that never came naturally anymore. The kitchen light flickered on, revealing the modest counters, the old fridge that hummed like a restless engine, the stack of unopened mail near the fruit bowl. He started breakfast the way he always did, one-handed where he could manage, relying on the prosthetic where he had to. Cracking eggs was an ordeal, but he had practiced until it became something between comedy and stubborn art. The shell resisted the prosthetic grip, and when it finally gave way, half the egg landed on the counter. He muttered under his breath, cleaned it up clumsily, and kept going. Toast was easier. Coffee was a ritual he refused to surrender, even though the weight of the kettle in his mechanical hand sometimes made him nervous. When the eggs were nearly ready, small footsteps sounded in the hallway. His daughter appeared, hair tousled from sleep, pajamas wrinkled. She rubbed her eyes with one hand and carried her stuffed rabbit with the other. She looked at him with the kind of love that didn't notice the metal glint of his prosthetic arm or the slightly uneven way he stood on his prosthetic leg. To her, he was just Dad. "Morning, Daddy," she mumbled, sliding into her chair. "Morning, sweetheart," he replied, turning toward her with a smile that hid how exhausted he felt. He set a plate in front of her and watched as she picked at her eggs before finally digging in. She chattered through breakfast the way she always did, telling him about her plans for school, about what her teacher promised they would learn, about how her friend Katie said she was going to bring stickers shaped like stars. He listened, nodding in the right places, his coffee cooling in his cup as he let her voice fill the empty spaces of the house. Her words, unfiltered and bright, kept him tethered to something normal. After breakfast came the rush of dressing, brushing teeth, finding the shoes that always seemed to disappear at the last moment. He helped where he could, fastening buttons with careful movements, but sometimes his daughter was faster than he was, her small fingers more nimble than the stiff grip of the prosthetic hand. She never complained. She only smiled as if it were the most natural thing in the world to tie her own shoes and then reach for his arm, guiding him gently toward the door. Outside, the morning air carried the smell of fresh grass and damp pavement. The street was quiet, houses lined up in neat rows, neighbors already heading to work. He held his daughter's hand with his real arm, feeling her warmth, while his other arm, the one made of metal and plastic, swung stiffly at his side. Each step on the prosthetic leg was measured, deliberate, but he had learned to mask the awkwardness. To passers-by, he looked like any father walking his daughter to school. He clung to that illusion. Halfway to school, they passed the corner where the small coffee shop sat. The sign above the door was painted in soft colors, the kind that suggested comfort and warmth. The smell of roasted beans drifted into the street, mingling with the sweetness of baked pastries. He hadn't meant for it to become part of their routine, but it had. His daughter tugged on his sleeve the first morning they stopped there, insisting on hot chocolate. From then on, the cafe had become a kind of sanctuary, a place where the day began, not with the harshness of the world, but with a pause, a small moment of peace. When they entered, the bell above the door chimed softly. The interior of the shop was always the same. Wooden tables polished smooth by years of use, shelves with books stacked unevenly, a counter where the smell of coffee was strongest. Behind the counter stood the woman who owned the place. She was not much older than him, perhaps early 30s, her hair tied back, her apron marked faintly with flour. She had a face that carried both strength and quiet sadness, though she smiled easily when she saw his daughter. "Good morning," she greeted warmly, leaning slightly across the counter. "The usual?" His daughter nodded eagerly, already climbing onto her favorite stool. "Hot chocolate, please, with marshmallows." "And coffee for you?" the woman asked, glancing at him. He hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, thank you." It was always the same. He never lingered longer than necessary, never gave more than polite responses. But the woman seemed to see more than he wanted anyone to. She had a way of looking at him, not at the prosthetic arm that rested stiffly at his side, not at the uneven gait of his step, but directly at him, as if none of it mattered. It unsettled him, though he could not deny the faint warmth it left behind. His daughter adored her. She talked endlessly as she sipped her hot chocolate, telling stories about school, about the rabbit she carried everywhere, about the silly jokes she had learned. The woman listened with genuine interest, laughing softly, sometimes crouching to the child's level to admire a drawing or ask a question. It was in those moments that he felt both gratitude and unease. Gratitude that his daughter found someone else to shower her with warmth. Unease that he, with his broken body, stood at the edge of it all, unsure if he belonged. After they finished, he would thank the woman with a quiet nod, gather his daughter and leave. But the smell of coffee, the warmth of that small shop, and the sound of the woman's voice lingered long after. The walk to school continued, his daughter skipping beside him, her small hand clutching his firmly. She never seemed to notice that he only held her with one hand now, that the other remained awkwardly at his side. She accepted it as though it had always been so, and he both loved and feared that acceptance. When he dropped her at school, he stood outside for a moment, watching as she disappeared into the crowd of children. She waved from the door, her smile bright enough to pierce through all the heaviness he carried. Then she was gone, and he turned back toward the house, the street suddenly empty without her. Back home, the silence pressed in again. The coffee he had bought at the cafe still warmed his hand, and he drank it slowly, trying to stretch the comfort it offered. He thought of the woman at the counter, her kindness toward his daughter, the way she never once flinched at the sight of his prosthetics. He shook his head, pushing the thought away. Such things were not for him anymore. The day passed in its slow rhythm. He cleaned, struggled with chores that once would have been effortless, repaired what needed fixing. The prosthetic arm was clumsy with fine work, the leg tiring after hours on his feet, but he pushed through it, determined that his daughter would never see him as weak. By late afternoon, he returned to the school to pick her up. She ran to him, arms wide, her voice high with excitement as she told him about her day. He bent slightly, gathering her close with his real arm, feeling her weight and warmth against him. That was what mattered, not what he had lost, but what he still had. On the way home, she asked if they could stop at the coffee shop again. He hesitated but gave in, because saying no to her was harder than anything else. The bell chimed again as they entered, and the woman behind the counter looked up, her smile softening as if she had been waiting for them. And so the ritual continued, day after day. Coffee for him, hot chocolate for his daughter, small conversations that never ventured too deep, smiles that lingered a little longer than they should have. The cafe became more than just a stop on the way to school. It became a place where the loneliness eased, even if only for a little while, a place where the sound of his daughter's laughter mixed with the warmth of someone else's presence. He did not yet realize that this small ritual was the beginning of something larger, that in the quiet exchanges over coffee and cocoa, a seed had been planted. For now he only knew that when the morning alarm buzzed and he dragged himself into another day, there was at least one thing he could look forward to: the chime of a cafe door, the smile of a woman who didn't look at what he had lost, but at what still remained. The days began to blend together, each morning opening with the buzz of the alarm and the same ritual of breakfast, school, and coffee. The cafe had become a second home in ways he had not expected. At first, it had been nothing more than convenience, a place to sit for a few minutes while his daughter drank her cocoa and he sipped his coffee. But with each passing week, the stop had turned into something more. The smell of roasted beans and fresh bread, the soft lighting inside, and most of all, the warmth of the woman behind the counter created a rhythm that his fractured life had come to depend on. She was always there, with her sleeves rolled to her elbows and a smudge of flour across her apron, smiling in a way that seemed to hold no judgment. He began to notice things he hadn't before, the way she leaned closer to hear his daughter's endless chatter, the way she remembered small details, like the fact that his daughter didn't like whipped cream or that he preferred his coffee without sugar. She had a memory for their lives, as though they mattered beyond the few minutes they spent in her cafe. For his daughter, the bond was immediate. She would often run ahead of him, bursting through the cafe door with uncontainable excitement, already calling the woman's name as though she belonged to their little circle. The child would sit at the counter and talk about school, about books she had read, about the picture she was drawing. Sometimes she would leave her sketches behind, taped to the side of the register or pinned to the corkboard where customers left notes. The woman kept every one of them. For him, it was more complicated. The kindness unsettled him. It had been years since he had allowed himself to be seen as anything other than a father, anything other than a man surviving from day to day. After the accident, he had built walls around himself, invisible but impenetrable, to keep the world from seeing his weakness. The prosthetic arm and leg were tools, but they were also symbols of his brokenness, reminders of what he had lost. People stared. They always stared. Even if they didn't mean to, even if they quickly looked away, he felt the weight of their curiosity, their pity. But in her cafe, the woman never looked at him like that. When she spoke to him, her eyes met his directly. She didn't linger on the mechanical gleam of his arm or the uneven gait of his walk. She asked about his day, about his daughter, about the small details of life that no one else seemed to care about. It should have been a comfort, yet it left him restless. He found himself looking forward to the mornings more than he wanted to admit, not only for his daughter's joy, but for the chance to exchange those small, ordinary words with someone who made him feel less invisible. At home, he thought about her more than he allowed himself to say. He would catch himself remembering her laughter, or the way she leaned on the counter when she was tired, or the absent-minded way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. These were small, human details, but to him they carried the weight of longing he hadn't felt in years. He told himself it was foolish. She was kind, yes, but kindness did not mean love. She smiled at customers all day. Perhaps he was no different from anyone else who walked through the door. He repeated these thoughts like armor, but the truth slipped through in quiet moments, when he lay awake listening to the ticking of the clock and thinking of the warmth of her voice. His daughter, however, seemed to notice everything. She was too young to understand love and its complexities, but she understood affection. One afternoon after they left the cafe, she skipped beside him and asked, "Daddy, do you like her?" He almost stumbled at the question. "Who?" he asked, though he knew. "The lady at the cafe," his daughter said. "You smile more when she talks to you." He laughed it off, ruffling her hair with his real hand, but the words echoed inside him long after. The bond deepened slowly, like water wearing away at stone. One winter afternoon, when the air outside was sharp and cold, the woman came from behind the counter to help his daughter with her coat zipper. Her hands moved with practiced gentleness, and his daughter leaned into her with the kind of trust reserved for family. Watching them, he felt something ache inside him. It was not jealousy, but a yearning for something he had not thought possible again. The presence of another adult to share the weight of caring, the quiet companionship of someone who saw both him and his child. There were nights when loneliness pressed too hard to ignore. He would sit in the living room after his daughter had gone to bed, staring at the prosthetic hand resting on the arm of the chair. The house was filled with silence, broken only by the ticking clock or the distant hum of passing cars. He imagined what it would be like if she were there, sitting across from him, sipping tea, speaking softly into the quiet. He chastised himself for these thoughts, but they kept returning, stubborn as the phantom pains that sometimes shot through the absent parts of his body. The turning point came on a rainy evening when he and his daughter stopped at the cafe later than usual. The place was nearly empty, the chairs already stacked on tables, the floor freshly mopped. He hesitated at the door, ready to leave, but the woman waved them in. "You're always welcome," she said, her voice warm over the sound of rain tapping against the windows. She made hot chocolate for his daughter and poured him coffee, even though the machines were already shut down. They sat at a corner table, the three of them together, while the storm raged outside. His daughter told a story about her school project, holding both their attentions with the seriousness only children can muster. When she finally dozed off against his side, her rabbit clutched tight in her arms, the cafe grew quieter. The woman cleared the mugs, then sat across from him instead of returning to the counter. "You look tired," she said softly. Not as a judgment, but as an observation born of care. "I manage," he replied, glancing down at the sleeping child. "You do more than manage," she said. "I see how much you do for her. She's lucky to have you." The words struck deeper than he expected. He looked away, struggling with the lump in his throat. Compliments were difficult. He never knew what to do with them. Finally, he whispered, "Sometimes I feel like she deserves more than I can give." The woman was silent for a long moment, then leaned forward, her voice quiet but steady. "She doesn't need more. She needs you, and you're here." He met her eyes then, and for the first time, he did not look away. The silence stretched, filled with something that neither of them dared name. He wanted to reach for her, to bridge the small space between them, but fear held him still. The weight of his prosthetic arm at his side reminded him of everything he had lost, of the walls he had built to keep disappointment at bay. When they finally left that night, his daughter's head heavy on his shoulder, he felt both comforted and unsettled. The woman's words followed him home, echoing in the quiet of the house. "You're here." It was such a simple truth, and yet it carried more weight than he knew how to bear. In the weeks that followed, he continued to visit the cafe, though each time felt different now. The air between them carried a charge, a quiet awareness that had not been there before. His daughter remained the bridge, drawing them together with her laughter and innocence. But beneath it, he could feel the invisible walls trembling, waiting for the moment when he would either let them fall or retreat behind them forever. And though he tried to fight it, though he told himself he was broken, unworthy, something inside him whispered the dangerous truth. He was beginning to fall in love. The season began to shift almost imperceptibly, the harsh chill of winter softening into the damp breath of early spring. Each morning, when he opened the curtains, the world outside seemed to carry a new hint of renewal. Green buds on bare trees, the smell of wet earth, the call of birds testing their voices again. Life was stirring, and in some ways he felt it inside himself as well, though he fought to suppress it. What he felt for the woman at the cafe was growing too strong to ignore, and yet he told himself again and again that silence was safer than risk. The cafe had remained their constant refuge. His daughter's feet seemed to know the way instinctively, carrying her to the counter where she would chatter and laugh as though she belonged there. The woman greeted them always with the same warmth, but lately her eyes lingered on him in ways that unsettled him. Sometimes when he looked up from his coffee, he caught her studying him as though she wanted to speak but held back. At night, those glances haunted him more than he cared to admit. One evening, after a long day of work that left him aching in both his real body and the parts he no longer had, he found himself thinking about her more intensely than ever. The apartment was quiet, his daughter asleep, her small breaths steady in the next room. He sat alone in the kitchen, staring at the prosthetic hand that rested on the table. It looked both foreign and familiar, a tool that allowed him to function but never quite feel whole. He thought of how she never seemed to notice it, how she spoke to him as though he were still entirely himself. And for the first time, he let himself imagine what it would be like to hold her with it, not as a burden or a reminder of loss, but as a part of him that could still give warmth, if she would let it. The next day, he almost didn't go to the cafe. Fear gnawed at him, convincing him to break the routine. But his daughter insisted, tugging his hand, saying she wanted to show the woman her new school project. So he went, and when the familiar bell above the door chimed, he felt the same wave of comfort and dread wash over him. The woman smiled at them as always, but there was something different in her expression, softer, almost expectant. They stayed later than usual, after most customers had left. His daughter, tired from the long school day, curled up in a corner booth with her rabbit, drifting off as the hum of the coffee machine faded. He helped the woman wipe down the tables, awkwardly balancing the rag in his prosthetic hand. She watched him with quiet appreciation, not pity, and it disarmed him completely. The cafe was hushed, the lamps casting a golden glow over the empty space, and in that silence the air between them grew heavy with unspoken words. When the last chair was stacked and the door locked, he found himself standing closer to her than ever before. She leaned against the counter, arms crossed, but her eyes never left his face. He could hear his own heartbeat thundering, his breath uneven, the weight of months of silence pressed against him, demanding release. "I need to tell you something," he began, his voice rough with hesitation. She tilted her head slightly, waiting, her expression open. "I don't know how to say it," he continued, fumbling. "And I don't know if it's fair to you, but I can't keep it inside anymore." His hand, his real one, tightened at his side while the prosthetic hung still, its mechanical joints faintly whirring as though mirroring his unease. "You've been more than kind to me and to my daughter. You've given us a place that feels like home, and He faltered, the words choking him. For a moment he almost retreated, almost buried the confession under silence again. But then he looked at her, and she was still watching him, her eyes soft, urging without a word. "I think I've fallen in love with you," he said at last. The truth broke free, sharp and terrifying, and once it was spoken, the silence that followed felt endless. He expected rejection, a polite dismissal, maybe even pity. He braced himself for it, his shoulders tense, his chest tight with shame. But she stepped forward instead, closing the space between them. Her hand reached for his, and without hesitation she took the prosthetic one in her grasp. The contact startled him. He had never imagined she would touch it so naturally. "I've been waiting for you to say that," she whispered. His breath caught. "You have?" She nodded, her thumb brushing lightly against the artificial surface, as though it were as natural as skin. "Do you think I come out from behind the counter for every customer? Do you think I keep every drawing a child makes, or stay open late just for anyone? I see you, not your arm, not your leg, not what you've lost. You. And I love what I see." The words sank into him like sunlight after a long winter. For months he had carried the fear that he was unworthy of love, that his broken body was too much for anyone to embrace. But here she was, holding his hand, his mechanical, imperfect hand, as if it were no different from any other. Something inside him gave way, the invisible walls crumbling at last. He stepped forward, awkwardly but determined, and with his one real arm he drew her into an embrace. The prosthetic arm joined, hesitant at first, then firmer, enclosing her in a hold that was as vulnerable as it was desperate. He buried his face in her shoulder, and for the first time in years he felt whole. "I don't know if I can give you the life you deserve," he whispered into her hair. "You already have," she murmured back. They stayed like that for what felt like forever. The hum of the refrigerators in the background, the rain tapping against the windows, their bodies pressed together in the quiet of the closed cafe. For once he didn't think about what was missing, only about what he had found. When they finally parted, his daughter stirred in the booth, blinking sleepily at them. She rubbed her eyes, then smiled knowingly, as though she had been waiting for this all along. "I knew it," she said simply. Then she laid her head back down, her rabbit clutched tight, and drifted off again. He and the woman shared a laugh, soft and unsteady, and for the first time, the future no longer looked like a long stretch of survival, but something warmer, brighter, and full of possibility. That night, as he walked home with his daughter's hand in one, and the memory of the woman's touch in the other, he realized that the confession had not only given voice to his feelings, it had given him back the part of himself he thought had been lost forever, the part that could love and be loved in return. The morning after his confession dawned differently. The light seemed softer, fuller, as if the world had shifted subtly during the night to make room for the new truth spoken in the quiet of the cafe. He awoke with the memory of her warmth still lingering on his skin, the sensation of holding her close refusing to fade. For the first time in a long while, he felt that something in his chest, Something long, dormant, and heavy had lifted. His daughter noticed it too. At breakfast, as she pushed her cereal around her bowl, she studied him with her careful, knowing eyes. "You're smiling," she said, almost accusingly, but then her lips broke into their own small smile. He ruffled her hair with his good hand, embarrassed and yet unashamed. Children had a way of seeing straight through to the heart of things. Their visits to the cafe took on a new character after that night. Nothing outwardly had changed. The same bell chimed above the door. The same smell of fresh coffee filled the air. The same warm light bathed the tables. But beneath those familiar details lived a new energy. She greeted them with the same smile, yet now there was an unspoken intimacy behind it, a softness that belonged only to him. Sometimes their fingers brushed as she handed him his cup, and the touch, though brief, carried more weight than any words. His daughter noticed these small changes as well, her eyes darting between them with satisfaction, as if she had been in on their secret all along. But life was not a fairy tale, and the challenges of his condition did not vanish in the glow of new affection. There were moments of frustration when his prosthetic hand clumsily dropped a cup, or when his leg ached from the strain of walking too far. There were nights when he lay awake wondering if he was asking too much of her, if love could withstand the burden of his limitations. Yet each time the doubt threatened to consume him, she silenced it with the simplicity of her presence. She would sit beside him in the quiet of closing time, listening to him speak of his fears, and answer not with grand promises, but with steady certainty. "I see you," she told him more than once, "all of you, and I want this." Those words were like anchors in stormy seas, grounding him when his own thoughts threatened to pull him under. His daughter thrived in the warmth of this new closeness. She followed the woman behind the counter, eager to help with the simplest of tasks, her laughter filling the small cafe. Soon she began drawing pictures that included the three of them, stick figures holding hands outside the little shop. He noticed that she always drew him with both hands, sometimes with a line marking the difference where the prosthetic was, sometimes not at all. To her it seemed the details mattered less than the whole. She was not imagining a broken man, but a father who loved her and someone who loved him in return. One evening, as spring blossomed fully and the air carried the scent of blooming flowers, he lingered after the cafe closed. His daughter had fallen asleep once again in the corner booth, her head resting on her stuffed rabbit, a picture of peace. The woman moved about the cafe, tidying here and there, though her pace was slower, more thoughtful. He joined her, helping where he could, until they both found themselves standing in the soft lamplight near the counter. The silence stretched between them, comfortable yet filled with unspoken questions. He reached out first hesitantly, then with firmer resolve and pulled her close. His real arm encircled her, his prosthetic pressed gently against her back, and this time there was no hesitation, no apology for the awkwardness of it. "I was afraid this would feel wrong," he confessed quietly, "but it feels like it was always meant to be." She looked up at him, her eyes shimmering in the half-light, and answered with a kiss that silenced every doubt. From that night on, their lives began to entwine more deeply. She became more than the owner of the cafe they visited. She became a part of their routine, their comfort, their family. Mornings sometimes began with her joining them on the walk to school. Evenings ended with shared dinners where laughter flowed easily and silences carried no weight. She learned how to fasten the straps of his prosthetic leg when fatigue made his hands clumsy. He learned how to grind the beans just the way she liked when she was too tired after a long day. These small acts of care wove them together more tightly than any dramatic gesture could. There were moments of vulnerability. Once his prosthetic hand malfunctioned while he tried to lift a heavy box for her, and it slipped from his grip, crashing to the floor. He swore under his breath, frustrated at his own limitations. But she knelt beside him, touched the side of his face, and said, "You don't have to prove anything to me." In that moment, he realized that love was not about being perfect or whole. It was about being present, even in imperfection. His daughter, too, blossomed in the glow of this growing bond. She began to call the woman by her first name with a familiarity that spoke of belonging, sometimes even slipping and saying "Mom" when she was tired or distracted. Each time it happened, a silence followed, filled with both tenderness and ache. He worried it was too soon, that such words might bring more pain than comfort, but the woman never corrected her. Instead, she accepted it with a quiet smile, as if acknowledging that love had many forms and names, and she was willing to carry them all. Seasons turned, and by the time summer spread its warmth over the city, their lives had settled into a rhythm that felt less like something new and more like something rediscovered, as though they had always been meant to find one another. The cafe thrived, filled with laughter and the aroma of roasted beans, but in the quiet hours after closing, it became their sanctuary. He no longer hesitated to sit beside her, to reach for her hand, to let his daughter curl up between them as they planned small dreams for the future. One evening, when the golden light of sunset spilled across the wooden tables, he found himself reflecting aloud. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been?" She tilted her head, curious. He gestured with his prosthetic hand, flexing the fingers that still sometimes felt alien to him. "If not for this, maybe we'd never have met the way we did." She placed her hand over the metal and plastic, pressing gently. "Then I'm grateful for every turn that brought us here," she replied. Her words, simple and unadorned, carried more weight than any reassurance. That night, as they walked home together, the three of them, he felt a peace he had not known since before the accident that had changed his life. His daughter skipped ahead, singing to herself, while he and the woman walked side by side, their hands entwined. The prosthetic that once felt like a barrier was no longer a symbol of what he had lost, but of what he had gained: resilience, hope, and the courage to love again. When they reached the small apartment, his daughter turned and looked at them both with sleepy seriousness. "Can we always stay like this?" she asked. He lifted her into his arms, careful with the balance of his leg, and kissed the top of her head. "Yes," he promised, his eyes meeting the woman's over the child's hair. "Always." The promise was simple, yet it held everything that mattered. Not perfection, not certainty, but the steady truth of love chosen every day. The cafe would always be there. The prosthetics would always be a part of him. The shadows of the past would never fully fade. But none of that mattered. What mattered was the warmth of her hand in his, the laughter of his daughter, the knowledge that even broken paths could lead to something whole. And so their story began again, not with loss, but with love. Not with endings, but with the quiet, enduring strength of a new beginning. If this story touched you, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next one. Check out our other videos for more powerful stories and stay tuned for what's coming soon. And please share this video with your friends and family. Some stories are too meaningful to keep to yourself.